Welcome to the second episode of Left Scotland's new series, The More You Can, where I try to take a complex idea, event or policy and explain it as quickly as possible. And the best part is, you, the audience, get to choose each week what the video is about. So this week's episode goes to Ruth Nichol, who wanted to find out about the impact of a Corbyn win on Scotland and the Union. As always, let's start at the beginning. So after the general election earlier this year, Ed Miliband resigns following something of a defeat which saw Labour lose their historic grasp of Scotland. Wait, no. Let's go back further to 1994. The Labour Party's been around for 94 years by this point when it decides to relaunch itself as New Labour, a party that's taken a step away from its historical aims and values, specifically through a change to Clause 4 of the UK Labour Party constitution. Okay, so this change involves ditching the idea of nationalising certain public services, such as railways amongst other things. Now this is a move away from traditional Labour, and was the beginning of Labour embracing a more neoliberal agenda and supporting privatising public services, not to mention the beginning of a journey towards some serious civil liberty offences, and that whole war thing. Now, such a departure was this from traditional Labour values that back in 2002 when Margaret Thatcher was asked what her greatest achievement was, she said Tony Blair and New Labour. Now, the birth of New Labour continued a trend of pulling the political discussion further to the right, something that has immensely benefited the Conservatives. Now, we're going to come back to that in a minute. Under New Labour, the privatisation of the NHS begins, weak trade union legislation stays in place, and tuition fees spring up for students. They had the chance to go a different route, and instead they followed along behind the Conservatives. And that's been the state of it for a while. In Scotland, the years under Thatcher had created a country that would barely touch the Conservative Party, so we would vote red every election regardless. In fact, since 1955, Scotland has voted Labour every single election, yet has had Conservative governments for about half that time because of the whole union thing, where our votes don't really count for much, but we aren't thinking about that, or that about a year ago today, we were in the middle of an amazing democratic process to possibly fix that. Keep it together, Stephen. So Scotland voted Labour, even though Labour weren't really Labour anymore, and they got complacent. Some candidates won seats in Scotland despite never actually going out and campaigning, hence the old joke about being able to get a monkey elected in Scotland if you just pinned a red rosette to it. And many monkeys were indeed elected. So now we cut forward to the general election. Labour has reached the point of being so like the Conservatives that people are either flocking away from them or literally see no point in voting for them. They've embraced the neoliberal agenda and have been abstaining from voting in bills ranging from welfare to the environment rather than being a half-decent opposition. Folk pretty much give up on them, they lose the general election, blame the SNP, then move on and get themselves together a little. Then the leadership debate begins following the resignation of Ed Miliband. 4 candidates come forward: Andy Burnham, the favourite, Liz Kendall, Yvette Cooper and of course Jeremy Corbyn, who only just manages to get selected with literally a minute or two to spare before the nominations shut. At this point, he doesn't think he's got a chance of winning. No one does. Corbyn is only there to pull the discussion over to the left and to keep the other candidates on their toes. The problem is, all the left-wing stuff that the pundits and Blairites and Labour keep on telling us will never be popular amongst the public is in fact incredibly popular amongst the public. So when Corbyn starts discussing renationalising the railways and energy companies, which has support in the region of around 66 to 68% of the population, funnily enough, folk actually sit up and listen. In a single day, over 165,000 people joined the Labour Party as either a member, an affiliate or a supporter, thus giving them the right to vote in the leadership contest. But the high Hegians don't want Corbyn in power. So, start what was infamously known as the Labour Purge. It was estimated that over 100,000 folk would eventually be kicked out of the party for the crime of talking about any other party in a reasonably favourable way. Some of the folk to get kicked out had been Labour Party supporters and trade union activists for years, but that did not matter and it didn't stop them. Really, it was about getting rid of as many Corbyn supporters as possible, since by this point there were already rumblings of party officials discussing ways to oust him should he actually be elected as leader. When the people don't vote the way you want, don't let them vote. And when they do it anyway, just kick the new leader out of power. That sounds strangely like New Labour's foreign policy. The too long didn't read version of this is that Corbyn won regardless, with almost 60% of the votes giving him first preference. So now the opposition party is led by a man with a history of being a part of the anti-war movement and who wants to nationalise key services. But what does that mean for Scotland? Are folk going to run back to Labour? Can Corbyn save the Union? Will people ever take any of John McTernan's predictions seriously? The answer to all of these questions is, I suspect, no. First of all, although Corbyn and the cabinet he has created is further left-wing than the SNP in a lot of ways, many of the rest of the Labour Party are still the same Blairites as before. Robert Peston has reported that there are even a few Labour MPs who right now are considering crossing over to the Conservatives. Remember when folk laughed about the whole Red Tories thing? Yeah, it might actually be happening. On top of that, Labour are going to be forever tainted by the referendum in Scotland for not only working hand in hand with the Conservatives, but for running a campaign that afterwards had Blair McDougall, the head of the No campaign, and subsequently head of policy and strategy for Scottish Labour, come out and say that they could never have won the referendum without intentionally scaremongering. In much the same way that many have never forgiven the Conservatives for Thatcherism, it'll be a long time before many will be able to look past what was essentially a fear-driven campaign aiming to bludgeon a popular movement for radical change in Scotland. It doesn't help too that Corbyn, despite being in support of a united and independent Ireland, opposes the same deal for Scotland. And finally, the biggest problem lies with Scottish Labour itself. They've spent so long trying to convince everyone that they are their own party, despite legally being essentially a branch office to the main UK party. So we have the strange position now where the Scottish Labour Party are further to the right than the main UK Labour Party, despite being based in Scotland, which opinion polls have consistently shown to be at least marginally to the left of England. While Corbyn wishes to abolish Trident, Kezia Dugdale will do anything to avoid even answering a question on whether or not a referendum should be held in keeping Trident, which was promised by Alex Rowley, the deputy leader.
Your deputy leader, Alex Rowley, has called for a referendum on Trident. Do you support him on that?
Well, Alex and I are both committed to redemocratising the Labour Party. What do we mean by that? We want the Labour Party to be a movement again where people come and debate ideas and vote on choices that form Labour Party policy. And we're going to create the space to debate issues just like Trident.
He was quite specific that there be a referendum on Trident. Do you support him on that?
We both agreed that we want to have a debate and space within the Labour movement to discuss these big issues.
A referendum, yes or no?
We were not talking about a referendum.
He was. Alex Rowley was.
Redemocratising the party, creating the space within the party to talk about these ideas.
A referendum. Do you agree with him or do you not?
What I want to see is space within the Labour Party created at party conference to debate big issues like Trident.
I'm not clear as to whether you agree or not with Alex Rowley. Do you or don't you?
I don't know how many times I have to say it to you, John, to make it absolutely clear that we both signed up to creating more space for Labour Party members to debate the big issues of the day.
Although it does seem like they might be willing to redemocratise the party and create a space where these ideas can be discussed, or something. But regardless, there's one big positive to Corbyn leading the opposition, and it's the real reason that the Conservatives are afraid of him, and it isn't because they think he can win the next election. The birth of New Labour was the beginning of a political discourse in the UK moving to the right. It's a slow process, but it's the reason that Thatcher knew she could never begin dismantling the NHS, while now under David Cameron, we've had the biggest sell-off of the NHS in its history. This is because of something called the Overton window. As the conversation gets pushed further and further to the right, as has been happening thanks to New Labour, other more extreme right-wing ideas become more acceptable, whereas more left-wing ideas grow more radical sounding and out there. As the window shifts, it basically dictates what is seen to be sensible, while whatever lies out with it is seen to be unthinkable. With Corbyn in a position of power as the opposition, this will allow the window to swing back to the left and show Cameron's policies as the right-wing extremist policies that they are. That's the real reason Cameron is worried by Corbyn. But even then, Corbyn probably still won't be able to save the Union. Anyway, that's everything for this week's episode of The More You Can. Comments below for whatever you would like to see covered next week, whether that's an explanation of what the hell quantitative easing is, or a summary of the Glasgow rent strikes as we hit the centenary of that event. Please do like, share and subscribe, and as always, I will see you again soon.